All right. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate your time. I know this is a busy time of year. It's been my tradition for many years now, at least a decade, I think, to give end of year talks about unpublished results. I have many, many, many notebooks full of unpublished results. Um, this year is a little different. Um, I've been working with an AI community for a while, and their subject matter has rekindled some of my own interests in the field, and so I have decided to think through um, all the stuff that led me along the way to the design of the row calculus and the OSLF algorithm, which generates types, and that led to some interesting observations with respect to a theory of mind. Uh, I was thinking about how I might introduce this material and realizing that at heart I'm a mathematician. I rarely do science. Science requires that you actually connect your mathematical models to the physical world, which means going through a whole bunch of experimentation. And I think that the closest I've gotten to that in my career is computer science, where the proofs are the experiments. So you it's not nearly as demanding as physical science. So I hope this is by way of apology. I hope that people understand that I'm really quite inexperienced when it comes to this sciencey stuff. I'm mo mostly a mathematician. Um, the talks are organized in three chunks. The first one is yeah, the three chunks are organized around the three chunks, the three phases of a magic trick, right? So there's the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. So in the pledge, I'm largely going to lay out exactly um, what the promise is, what you're going to be seeing as a part of this material. And surprisingly, just that alone will take up all our time today. But let me go ahead and get started then. So the essence of this argument is that the origin of mind recapitulates the origin of life. Um, there are two remarkable events in the geologic record that have no explanation. So the first of these is the transition from prebiotic Earth to biotic Earth. So we can see in the geologic record Earth with no life, and then Earth with life. So that's an objective fact, but we don't have an explanation, a satisfying explanation for which there is scientific consensus around how that transition takes place. In fact, some members of the scientific community feel quite strongly and have put in print that it was entirely accidental, that life is immeasurably rare, whereas a growing number of folks are beginning to suggest that no, life is much less rare, and that there are scientific laws that govern the emergence of life. And this talk, I imagine you're already suspecting, is closer to that camp than the other. The second is the transition from uh, Earth with life, but nothing that humans typically recognize as mind, to Earth with species that have mind. Again, we can quibble about, whether or not other species have mind. And I think that, that's a very fruitful and interesting conversation. I'm taking a sort of higher level view right now. Um, Certainly, a large percentage, even of the scientific community, recognizes that there's at least a difference in quality of mind, if not in kind, between Homo sapiens and other species. Now, for good or for ill, it is a difference in certainly in quality, and that difference in quality is so striking as to almost be a difference in kind. Um, I'm going to stop there and make sure that this makes sense to folks. People understand the events I'm talking about and why they're objective and yet have no explanation, a scientifically accepted explanation. Oh, all right.
It's clear so far, if for what it's worth,
Okay, rock and roll. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go find analogs of these events in a certain space of all models of computation. I'm going to need to talk a little bit about that space. We won't get into the details of that until the second talk. But I just want to share that kind of global perspective on computation is very, very modern. Most research, if you go look at the literature, most research in models of computation are depth first, deep diving into a particular model of computation, such as the lambda calculus with explicit substitutions, or the pi calculus with nonces added so you can reason about security, or yada yada yada. Very, very, very rarely have we had the opportunity afforded to us to be able to get a global view of the entire universe of models of computation. That's a quite fresh perspective, and it helps a lot when considering these larger questions like origin of mind and origin of life. And what I'm going to argue is that within this universe, the events will appear as fixed points of certain kinds of processes. So for those in the categorical no, these fixed points are like the limit points of certain algebras. Right, so algebras are coalgebras of a monad. When you think about them as closure systems, that allows you to draw a connection to dynamical systems. And so these fixed points will appear in the dynamical systems perspective as attractors. And the fact that they are fixed points or attractors will play a key role in arguing why these events, when transported from the beautiful theoretical world of computer science and mathematics over into the physical world, why life and mind are inevitable. And certainly they're inevitable in the computational universe. So when we organize our thinking along these lines, these events are inevitable computationally. And if our interpretation of the information theoretic landscape is a faithful representation of what happens in the physical universe, then it explains why actual life and mind are inevitable. So that's the, essentially, if you take nothing away from the rest of this talk, that is the key point I'm trying to get across. Now, you might ask, well, why do we care about computation? Right? Why are we focusing on that? And the argument is because AI told us to. Not because our AI overlords are holding a whip to our head or a gun to our head and saying, it must be this way, but rather because there's a fundamental hypothesis in AI that useful and important aspects of human, I want to stress human because I haven't seen a lot of AI that focuses on the natural intelligence of, for example, colonies of slime mold or beehives. So that useful or important aspects of human intelligence can be realized as computations. So if we're going to take that perspective, then that allows us to just restrict our attention to just what we can achieve with a computation and nothing else. So I want to hammer this point home. So I'm going to repeat this in another way, right? So I'm arguing that for AI, the core proposition underlying AI is one about the fact that aspects that we consider important of intelligence can be faithfully represented as computation, right? So even the name artificial intelligence is a misnomer, right? Now, however, I should point out that the artifice part comes back in when we demand that the computations that we consider be rendered efficiently to machines that we can both manufacture and manipulate at scale. So, a lot of the AI community is quick to point to Solomonoff induction as saying, yeah, look, see, there's a formalism which ought to be able to do anything intelligent, but it's computationally inaccessible, and so it's effectively irrelevant. So that's a position that I've seen espoused, for example, within the Singularity Net community and outside of it. As a mathematician, I'm a little bit more circumspect about taking that position. Just for example, the transcendental numbers are largely inaccessible. They contain infinite information that is effectively uncompressible, and yet they impact our lives, right? So pi and e and a handful of other transcendental numbers have turned out to be oracles for us for a lot of modeling, right? E, for example, is used quite a lot in modeling biological phenomena, for example, and just as a kind of psychological trick, I want to point out that E is also the solution. It's a fixed point, right? It's the solution to F is equal to df dx. So I'm not sure that just because something is computationally inaccessible in certain ways necessarily means that it's irrelevant. I think that's too harsh a position, but I do take to heart the perspective that being able to render the important parts of intelligence as computations that we can manufacture and manipulate at scale has societal consequences. So that part I get. Let me stop again and just check. Is this landing? People understand what I'm saying here?
Yeah, but I might have a question. So
Sure.
by inaccessible computation, I get that she means something that's not feasible, at least currently. So it's time dependent, right? If I get that right, let's say in the future, I know quantum computing on a large scale arrives. Does that change what's accessible? Is that a good definition of the word that I'm using here?
That's a very good. I like that question a lot. Uh, I mean, I certainly believe that there are computations that, how do I say this? That the light cone of what we can reach, and the limits of that may be much larger than we think. But there's some ordinals, right, that are so far out there that no matter what we do, if we were Turing machines, no matter what we do, we're never going to get there.
Right,
Right. So
right,
I agree with you that accessibility is is sometimes in the eye of the beholder, and that's another flavor of the point I was trying to make, right? So just because the complexity of Solomonoff induction feels out of reach, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't ways to access some of the explanatory power that lives there. So I would be, just as a mathematician, I would be very cautious about writing things off. I think that's all I'm saying.
okay.
So thank
Yeah.
you for that question.
Thanks for the answer. Thank
So Greg, are you going in the direction of like creating a topos for these attractors and uh what I want to say? I don't have the right term here, but the emitters, like you have in like a flow state, so that uh, you're going to demonstrate with this is almost a new theory of mind. Do I have that right?
I'm definitely going to put forward a new theory of mind. Uh,
Okay.
as near as I can tell, it's new. I'm not an AI researcher, so maybe people have already thought of this, but I don't believe, I have not read anything that indicates that people have already thought of this.
And this is in like Penrose's super Turing direction.
That will come in the prestige. I will
Okay.
I will connect after I've laid out the groundwork for being able to talk about this computationally so that we can all calculate so that it's objective, and we can both calculate in the theoretical model, and then think of how from the model think about how to conduct experiments that would validate or falsify
Uh, uh,
the model,
okay.
right?
Cool. All right. Got it.
So that part will come in the second talk. This talk, I'm just trying to lay the groundwork so that when I roll out the model, you're not going, why do I care about this formalism? This is the motivation part, so that when we come to the second talk, you're like, okay, I understand why we're using this formalism as opposed to any other formalism. I should also mention that there is a utilitarian perspective with respect to this with respect to this idea of inaccessibility. There's a utilitarian perspective that says, who cares whether or how mind arises, as long as, whatever we come up with works, so it solves problems. And because I'm going to focus on what I believe are important aspects of an actual theory. When a theory of mind has explanatory power. And I think a lot of folks in AI are like, we don't care, this program classifies dogs and cats. I don't care whether this is an actual mind, right? It works in some ways like humans do. That doesn't feel very satisfactory to me. And I want to relate that back to something that happened in physics, right? So there was a sort of phase or trend in physics, when people were facing some fairly foundational questions with respect to the interpretation of the quantum mechanical framework. And the response was, shut up and calculate. Just, the math works, just calculate. I don't want to hear no stinking questions about fundamentals or foundations. And that's stymied investigations into quantum foundations for decades. But now that we're doing quantum computation at larger and larger scales, people have been forced to reinvestigate the foundations, and the dividends for investigating the foundations have been enormous, from the ZX calculus to this new work by Jacob Brandes on a stochastic presentation of quantum mechanics. The payoffs are immense. And I believe that this same kind of thing is going to happen in AI. A utilitarian perspective will only get you so far, and then when you try to do things at scale, you will start to get diminishing returns. So
it has a practical implication on where we should go with our building these systems.
Absolutely. That's the point. So you may say, oh, he's a mathematician. What does he know about science? Right. So I want to argue that wouldn't a satisfying explanation of mind explain why we see mind arising naturally? Right. So right. And so now if we just follow it through, right, then if we're saying that mind is somehow essentially or primarily, or at least importantly, a computational phenomena, shouldn't a proper theory of that computational phenomena show it as inevitable, like a fixed point? Right. That's sort of in a nutshell. Again, if you take nothing away from this talk, maybe this little nugget, if I plant these questions in your minds, then maybe you will also feel this discomfort around efforts like LLMs. Like, there's nothing in the LLM presentation to me that has this kind of explanatory power. I don't see how an LLM would arise under natural selection. So the consequences of getting this right are striking. Like, once you say, you take on board, okay, all AIs are programs, then one of the first consequences is that programs can only see programs, right? And by see, I mean they can only be sensitive to programs. So, if you think about wiring up one of your favorite algorithms to a sensor, the first thing you have to do, if you're actually going to wire it up, is to translate the sensor data into something, a data structure, i.e. a program, that your algorithm can operate on. Programs can only see programs. That's it. They are ontologically isolated. They live in the computational universe and no other. But that's really important, because it means that AIs can only classify programs. Right? And that means the only kind of learning behavior that an AI can do is to learn program behavior. That's gigantic from my perspective, right? Because by simulation, like, we have a classification theorem for all computational behavior. And this has been known since the 80s. By simulation completely classifies all program behavior. In fact, all forms of equivalence on program behavior factor through by simulation. It's the finest relationship. So the very limit of what an AI can do is to learn by simulation. That's it. There's nothing else. So even if you think you're teaching the AI to classify cats and dogs, or classify, major key from minor key, all you're actually doing is teaching it some bisimulation, some corner of the simulation relationship plus some kind of coarsening. Everything can be characterized in that way. For me, that's amazing because it's a great simplification. I can let go of a lot of burdens. I just want to get my programs to learn by simulation. Hooray! Right. And again, you know, maybe someone says, but wait a minute, biosimulation is undecidable in the general case. And that's totally true. However, in the practical cases, it turns out the biosimulation has a much better complexity characteristics. So for example, if your programs only have a finite menu from which they draw their actions, so like, you know, regular expressions and things like that, then there's a parallel linear time algorithm.
Is there a theorem, right? This is that all finite transition systems can be classified as with respect to whether they're bisimilar in polynomial time, right?
For the finite menu of operations, it's parallel linear.
Okay.
Right. And you know, for certain kinds of language problems, like certain language equivalence problems, when you turn them into the bisimulation versions, you go from like p-space complete down to polynomial, or undecidable down to polynomial. So the complexity characteristics of bisimulation in reality, like the 80% case, the case we're usually dealing with when we're trying to write practical programs, are fantastic. They're much better than the, oh, it's undecidable in general. But the other important point is that the biosimulation classes are completely characterized by the Hennessy-Milner logics. So that's going to become really important. And I will just tell you up front why this is important. The biosimulation equivalence classes become the ontology that an AI can learn. It's a classification of all the phenomena in the world that it inhabits. And the Hennessy-Milner logics, the formulae in the Hennessy-Milner logics, what they do is they give you a way of talking about, they give you a language for that ontology. So, I mean, I will talk about that in more in greater depth, but it's hard. I've noticed that fact is a big shift for people. And I'll explain why that's the case with some examples. But this is going to play a key role in our theory of mind. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what the first fixed point is. So the first fixed point, so we're going to focus on two fixed points, but there are more of them. There are a lot of them, in fact. But the first of these fixed points is in which located computation uses computation as locations. So if we think about it, all physical computation must be located. That's because it's physical. Right? It takes place within a bounded spatiotemporal region. But it's more than that. If you think about, you know, for those of you who are actual programmers, when you do things like translate the lambda calculus into a register machine, the registers and memory addresses act as locations, and just the mechanism by which we arrange for a function to come in contact with its arguments has to do with manipulating locations, right? The function pointer, a location, needs to be put into contact with the registers or addresses where the data that the function code needs resides. So even though the lambda calculus in and of itself seems to not have a notion of location that is very far from the truth. And an example of this transformation at the theoretical level is the transformation from the pi calculus to the row calculus, right? So the pi calculus is a theory of computation that is dependent upon a theory of names, right? And the demands it places upon a theory of names forces names themselves to smuggle in a notion of computation. And so Rowe says, hey, why don't we just embrace that and just have names be computations themselves? So that's an example. It turns out that this transformation could be done for lots and lots and lots of models of computation, infinitely many models of computation. It is not specific to Rowe, but with Rowe, the reason I use Rowe as an explanatory mechanism is because it's so simple. It's very easy to, like, once, like it, the grammar takes 2 lines. The comma rule takes 1 line. The biggest part of it is expressing the equations. So it takes half a page to write down the row calculus. So you can see the whole thing, the whole virtual machine on half a page and wrap your mind around it. But this phenomena of creating this fixed point between located computation where computations are locations. And that's what this picture is depicting, right? So if inside this box we had a 2-level type decomposition of the algebra for processes, right? Then we have some ground processes like the 0 process. And normally we'd get some notion, some theory of names or locations coming in. But when we take the processes that come out from this theory and loop them back in, right? That's what this picture is depicting, right? And so this is a string diagram version of how you find the row calculus. In other words, the row calculus is discovered, not invented. So let me give a brief digression on the ubiquity of located computation. Now, again, I apologize for those folks who are not mathematicians, but this is a very, very exciting example. On one page, I'm going to point you to an infinite number of brand new set theories, right? So for the longest time, set theory has occupied a very special place as the foundation of mathematics. And now I'm going to describe for you an infinite number of brand new set theories. And it all comes from being able to make copies of a theory, right? So that's something that the set theorists don't think about. They don't think about locating their theories, and the idea of making copies is inextricably linked with notions of location. So imagine you've got your favorite flavor of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, so ZF set theory, but we're going to make one copy which we call red and the other which we call black. And the red element of relation can see into red sets, so it can see between red braces. And the black element of relation can see between black braces. But the red element of relation cannot see into black sets. And likewise, the black element element of relation cannot see into red sets. So we can summarize these ideas. So a set is of the form between 2 braces, put as many sets as you want. So if you put no sets, that's the empty set. And this recursion scheme, as it were, will generate, depending on what you mean by star here, will generate all the sets that you want for some particular universe of discourse for set theory, right? We have 2 copies, and what that does is it allows us to modify these specifications here to ones in which we have as many copies, as many sets or atoms as you want. And so now we get 2 versions of that. And if I simply set the red atoms to be the black sets, and the black atoms to be the red sets, then we can recover Frankel-Mostovsky set theory, which is a set theory with atoms, which has been used by Pitts and Gabay and many others to account for nominal phenomena. Right? So nominal set theory, nominal type theory, nominal logic, all that stuff is grounded on Frankel-Mostovsky set theory, but they take on the risk of what are these atoms? Where do they come from? Hey, this explains where the atoms come from. Right? And there's nothing special about two. We didn't just have to have two colors. We can have n colors, right? And we don't necessarily have to have a cycle in terms of the way that the atoms are related with each other. So I've delivered on my promise of an infinite number of set theories, which are brand new. There's no papers about this kind of set theory. And I got it just by having copies. In other words, locating the computation. So locations are absolutely essential, and they're the beginning of spatiality. And so if you want to know how space emerges, it begins to emerge from this notion of location. And the first fixed point is when locations are computations themselves. So
could you please go back to the previous slide for a second?
Yeah, sure.
What do you mean by this pipe operator there?
That's just an or.
Oh, that's just an or. So it's
Either
set theoretical.
a set or an atom. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so all this slide does is to give you a concrete example. So how do I get this pretty row calculus syntax from the pi calculus? Well, if I write down a two-level type decomposition of the pi calculus, in other words, I get a domain equation for pi, right? So the 1 is 0. This is the input. This is the output. This is parallel composition. And then this thing is new, and it's because it's anticipating the fixed point. If a location if we had a map from locations to processes, then I could dereference a location and get back a process, right? So this is the two-level type decomposition and just filling in the fixed point, right? So P is parameterized in a notion of location. And if I make that notion of location be the processes, right? That's this little equation here, the row calculus pops out. Right. So this and all I want to say is that this fixed point like this happens everywhere. Fixed points like this are scattered all over the information theoretic landscape, and that's something to hold on to. You know, again, if you take away that one point, it's really important because I'm going to argue something about that. So I need to move along very quickly here. So why is this like life? Locations become the code that is available to programs to manipulate program structure in the same way that DNA is the code that is available to manipulate the properties of the autocatalytic networks. Right? So DNA arises through basically, you know, the story that's emerging is you get these autocatalytic networks showing up in the chemistry. This happens relatively fast. They start competing with each other. And whenever anyone stumbles into this fixed point of the locations being the programs, then they have a big leg up on the other autocatalytic networks. And so that begins to dominate, right? So and what I'm trying to argue is if you think about DNA and you're trying to map this computational phenomena onto life, DNA is intrinsically linked to the autocatalytic network that it controls. Its very makeup comes from the reactions that are in the autocatalytic network. So I mean, for me, I've been living inside the row world for over 20 years, right? So this is very clear to me, but it might take others a while to digest and think about. And now I'm going to go straight to the next punchline, right? So the second event lifts that fixed point to the types world. So remember, I said that the Hennessy-Milner logics completely characterize the bisimulation equivalence classes. So let's go through this argument carefully. The bisimulation equivalence classes are the only ontology that AIs can actually manipulate. That's it. Now, obviously, you can coarse in them, but up to some factorization, that's all they can do. The Hennessy-Milner logics will correspond to types. And so the types completely classify the computational universe. So there's a moment when the types become available as terms to the programs. So think about programs or organisms. Types are an ontology of organisms. We're going to turn that ontology back into programs that programs can manipulate. So that is the bite, or it's a certain step towards being able to take a bite of the apple. Now you have programs that can reason about their own view of the world. They can hypothesize by making a type which is a hypothesis of the world, and they can test it by running programs, and they can modify their types based upon what comes back, right? In other words, programs can do science once the types have become terms in the programming world. So, and what I'm going to argue is that this fixed point is exactly like this fixed point.
So does this give us a theory of LLMs and their computational limits?
I'm not focused on LLMs. I can relate it back to LLMs, but that's not where I'm going.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, what you see on this line above is a pretty type language. And here's how you get it, right? So if I do a 2-level type decomposition of a certain transformation of the lambda cube, so the extremal point on the lambda cube, or the top of the lambda cube. So I should provide some context. Mike Stay, largely Mike, but Mike and I have been working on a functor, functorializing the lambda cube. So what I mean by that is, remember, we're working in this big giant universe of all computational models. That turns out to be a category. There's a functor on that category that imbues each model of computation with its own particular version of the lambda cube. And the lambda cube has an extremal point, which we will call the calculus of constructions, which is what it is in the ordinary lambda theory, right? That extremal point, if you write it down using 2-level type decomposition for row calculus, for example, it's this equation. And when you calculate the fixed point for the types, you get this type system. It is exactly the same, but on fixed point, but only happening now at the type level. So these are the consequences of getting this right. So I just want to remind everyone, why do I say that types give us the ontology? Because two programs will be bisimilar, i.e. inhabit the same bisimulation equivalence class, if and only if they satisfy exactly the same set of types. And what we're saying is that there's a moment when the world of programs, becomes imbued with this capability to manipulate types as if they were programs. And that's the moment when they can make hypotheses and test them against programmatic behavior. So programs can do science at that point. So I've said all these points, so I can skip this slide. I want to now make a distinction between ontology that arises culturally versus ontology that arises what I will say objectively. Now, I'm using those words with some trepidation, but I just want to I need some language to hang these concepts on. So we can imagine the categorization of music in terms of culturally recognized categories like pop or jazz or classical or rock, right? And then there are all these weird overlaps, like so Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, right? A watershed album. Is that rock or is that jazz? Right? So, you know, there's a lot of overlap in these categories. They're very squirrely, and it's although Tower Records, may they rest in peace, did use this for classification and searching of music. I would like to point us in a different direction for the classification and searching for music in terms of objective properties that everyone will agree on, like beats per minute. Like if you have the audio file, you can detect beats per minute. Now we're at the point where if you drop an audio file into SoundCloud, it can automatically detect instrumentation. Like if you drop an audio file into GarageBand, it can detect a key and a whole host of other properties that are objective that arise from the actual data. And so the ontology that arises from biosimulation is like this. Now, I want to confess, I want to come clean that, you know, I have had to sit through many ontology standards meetings in the biosciences and in other sciences where people argue about various classification schemes. And my own sense of it was, by the time you have resolved these, we will have new data about this field, and your classification schemes will be exploded again.
Wait here for a second. Let's say you have this objective ontology, objective classification, and then comes something like John Cage's 433, right?
Sure. No.
What then?
No, but that's a really good point, and I take that I take that to heart. I'm this analogy is only partially applicable.
Right.
Right?
Is that a problem?
It's not a problem relative to the proposal that I'm putting forward, because we're working in the universe, the category of all known computational models. So if the phenomena lives outside of all known computational models, then yes, we'd have to go. But right now we can do everything, all the classical things and all the stochastic things and all the quantum things within this computational universe. So if it lives outside of that, then that would be.
You can argue that John Cage's composition lives inside this space, right?
Yes. So maybe that has to do with I don't want to go there just yet, but maybe it has to do with recognizing intention, right? Because he's putting a wrapper around the 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's kind of it's even called. I've seen it called sometimes musical indeterminacy, right?
Sure. Yeah.
That's that, I guess.
Right, but you know, our models include a non-determinism quite strongly. But you raise an important point. I think what it has to do with, simply put, is putting a boundary around some space and time in which to consider that space and time as if it were musical. In which case, again, it's objective, because you have to objectively specify the boundary, like 4 minutes and 33 seconds.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's brilliant, actually. Thanks.
No, thank you. I appreciate the question. Okay, so again, the point here that I'm trying to make, and again, I'm just laying out the groundwork. We'll make this argument much more deeply in the second talk, is that these fixed points are the same. That one is literally the same fixed point iterated at the type level. And so the argument I'm going to make to you is that this iteration of the fixed point is the origin of mind, or it's one of the origins of the mind. And I'll get to some of the difficulties here or nuances, I should say, in a bit. But the origin of mind recapitulates the origin of life. So that's what I will argue. And I want to suggest to you that, conferences like Strange Loops and Doug Hofstadter's Gödel Escherbach, his attraction to these strange loops. These fixed points are those strange loops. And that's why people who think about AI and intelligence find themselves attracted to these kinds of loops. I'm arguing that there's a rational reason for that. And again, if we take the dynamical systems view, they are these fixed points are attractors. And now comes a really important step in the argument. So I want to argue that selective processes like adaptive diffusion or natural selection, if they're wandering around more or less randomly in these phase spaces, they'll get sucked into these attractors. So this is very important, right? So I want to argue that the physical landscape is like a refined version of the information theoretic landscape. It has more dimensions to it. And we can already see that the information theoretic landscape is littered with these fixed points. They're like little black holes all over this universe, the computational universe. And that if our compute has anything to do with the physical world, then we're going to find all these black holes sitting inside that. Now, suppose that I want to propose. All right, let me do it in 2 steps. Imagine that we have a structural exploration process like crossover and mutation, but we've divorced it of a fitness function. So it's effectively a kind of Brownian motion. So this structural exploration is just sloshing around randomly. And some of the results of this exploration get within the event horizon of one of these attractors. There is no escaping it. Once that happens, vroom, the structural exploration will be hijacked, and they will go off towards that fixed point, and they'll pop out of the wormhole. The organisms on the other side of that will internalize that fixed point, and they will have they'll have the property of that fixed point, and then they can move on again with random structural exploration until they enter into the neighborhood of another fixed point. So this is the picture I want you to keep in your mind. So imagine this giant landscape. You have random structural exploration, and the fixed points provide a notion of fitness. So you don't have some outside force that, like us programming the system. Rather, what's happening is information theoretically, there are these fixed points that are objective. They're a part of the computational landscape. And so they are what determines fitness. So, and I also want to argue that these so I might run over by 5 minutes. Does that work for folks?
Sure.
Okay, all right. But it won't be more than that. I'm going to argue that this falling into attractors has a close correspondence to phase transitions. It's going to look like, from a certain perspective, it's going to look like a phase transition, right? So when all the organisms suddenly have a property like before they had locations, but now the locations are computations, that's going to look like a phase transition. All the organisms, we had a heterogeneous population, and then boom, on the other side of that fixed point, they all have this property that's internalized in their structure. That's a phase transition. All right, so what are we going to do to ground this in science and not just mathematics? In particular, how do we compare it to actual origin of life? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the experts. So I'm going to focus on the work of Doctors Eric Smith, Lee Cronin, and Sarah Walker. And I'm just going to briefly sketch what they do. So Smith argues that life should be investigated from the perspective of the whole biosphere, and that the notion of phase transition plays this key role in how the biosphere emerges from these abiotic geospheres. So he identifies the atmosphere, the lithosphere, and the hydrosphere, and we can imagine those geospheres pre-life. And then he's arguing that we get this new geosphere, the biosphere, as a phase transition, because all those geospheres are being pushed to an extremal point because of the energy of the sun. So that whole, all the chemistry of those geospheres is actually way at an extreme. It's out of any equilibrium, because the energy of the sun is pounding on the earth. And so we're by all rights, we should see a phase transition. And in fact, many of them, stacks of them, related to the fact that the system is always being pushed out of equilibrium because of the sun. And so examples is that the entire biosphere can be divided into organisms that eat light or heat, and organisms that eat each other. Right. So that's I have some pictures of this, but basically the entire biosphere has an inside and an outside. And further, the entire biosphere can be subdivided into the way, in the direction of electron flow as the carrier of energy. So these are characteristics of the entire biosphere. All the organisms. Another example is that the Krebs cycle is conserved across all life. There isn't an instance of life that you can point to that doesn't have a version of the Krebs cycle. Right? So this is something that's biosphere, whole biosphere property. Right? So let me just summarize what I just said. The entire biosphere has an outside, the energy-eating organisms, and an inside, the organism-eating organisms. And all of those organisms conserve. Then they're further articulated by the direction of electron flow, and all of the organisms conserve the Krebs cycle. So that's a fairly compelling view that we should be thinking about life, not in terms of whether an individual is an instance of life, but that life needs to be looked at from the entire biosphere perspective. And what I tried to do is to set things up so that you understand his idea of phase transition is going to correspond to this idea of falling in to an attractor and popping out the other side. That's my argument. So again, notice that even for Smith, ontology begins to emerge by considering objective properties of the biosphere. Right? So we're starting to see inside, outside, and this articulation of how electrons flow along with conservation. That is an ontology that emerges from the objective properties of the biosphere. So we're seeing exactly that same thing recapitulate kind of at the meta level. Almost there. So concomitant with this, we have Lee Cronin and Sarah Walker that are basically trying to provide a life meter. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But assembly theory is something that they have put together that they argue explains when an arrangement of matter is an instance of life. And essentially, there are two numbers that they're looking at. One is the assembly index, and the other is high copy number. And that copy number bit is very important for our argument. So how do we understand the assembly index? Well, imagine you've got a Lego castle, and you smash it down to just the individual Lego blocks, right? And what we want to do is we want to reassemble the Lego castle using a particular process. We randomly select some Lego blocks, like 2 of them, and we connect them, and whatever the results of however we've wired up the parts that we randomly selected from the pool, we put them back in the pool. And then we rinse and repeat. And we just keep doing that until a castle emerges. Right? So some of those paths will just end in utter failure, right? And so we'll have to go back to atoms again or some earlier stage. And so the assembly index is the shortest path amongst all those paths that reassembles the castle from the blocks. And notice that there's something crucial about this process, right? Which is the process has a built-in memory. You're not allowed to jump to any sort of pre-understood endpoint. You can only randomly wire some things together and put that back in the pool to be selected again. Right? So this is a selective process. So assembly theory says that life has a high assembly index. But it also says that life has a high copy number, right? And I have put it to Lee and to Sarah, what corresponds to the picture frame here that allows me to count the number of Lego Castle kits that I've got. So what I'm going to argue in the next talk is that that copying and location are critically intertwined, and that when you start to take account of the frame where you can actually count copies, that leads you right back to the row calculus. And that whole apparatus gives you what's necessary to properly treat the notion of copy number. So that's the formal end of the talk. I will make 2 remarks very quickly. So in the notion of mind that's here, there is no awareness. So programs can do science, but they don't have an inner experience. They don't have a what is it like to be a bat kind of thing. However, Mark Solms and Carl Friston have put together what I believe is an extremely compelling argument for what is an inner experience and why it would be selected for in a natural selection process. In other words, it's another fixed point characterization. And basically, that characterization is how good of a predictor are you? So if the predictive apparatus of the program is doing well against data, the program is copacetic, feels peaceful. If the predictive apparatus is doing poorly against the data it's receiving, then it suffers. So what you're really the suffering versus copacetic is actually just a numerical framework or a quantification of do whatever you need to do to make your predictions improve against the data. So the fact that we can have programs do science, remember that was the point I was making, we give them enough to do science, we can now add this extra apparatus, which we can select for via a fixed point to make programs suffer. In other words, they have an inner experience, which is make your predictions get better against the data. And until your predictions get better against the data, you keep getting low scores. And your goal is to get a high score. So that's how the inner experience and so-called consciousness also fits into this framework of fixed points. So that's it. I lied. I said I'd only go 5 minutes over. I went 10 minutes over. But I'm available for questions if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Greg, are you in touch with Sarah Walker or any of the people who you are deriving some of your work from?
I have attempted via Twitter to be in touch with Lee and Sarah, and they have assiduously avoided all my comments on their posts.
I'm flying to Phoenix on Sunday, and I think she's based either in Tempe or Phoenix. Would it be
ASU. Yeah. I mean, if she'll talk to you, I'd love to talk to her.
That's exactly what I wanted to know. If I can track her down and get in touch, I think if you could give me a sort of one paragraph description of her relevance to this fascinating line of inquiry, that will help me try to track her down and see if I can't connect the two of you. I think if she understood what you were talking about, she'd be immensely flattered and efficiency, and it's another way to get the word out.
Yeah, sure. I can get you a précis of what we're talking about. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I'll see if I can't track her down for you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. Any other questions or comments?
So, Greg, if I understand this correctly, and I want to relate this to, say, a topos, there's a set of rejectors, attractors, maybe even saddle points, and you're arguing that the attractors, these fixed points, are one of the key aspects of the origin of mind.
Yeah, in fact, I'm saying specifically which fixed points. So I'm giving you 3 fixed points. One is located computation, where the locations are computations. 2, when that model gets reified as types that are available as terms, and then which allows programs to do science. And then 3, when the programs can be motivated to become better predictors. So those 3 fixed points are what I argue is the origin of mind, and it recapitulates the origin of life. So the first fixed point is effectively origin of life, and the other 2 are origin of mind, and both of them are recapitulations of origin of life.
Okay, and then taking this approach, then you could extend this to identify like all the spin cycles and everything else that would be related in a topological space. So this would provide a mechanism, a way of mapping out the complex system over time. So So that it seems to me like this could have implications on, have much broader implications.
Yeah, I think it has very broad implications, right? Oh, one thing that I should point out is because we're working in the category of graph structured lambda theory, so all known models of computation, each model comes with its own ontology. So I'm not proposing that there's one ontology that rules them all, right? There'll be an ontology for the lambda calculus that's very different because that will be based on applicative bisimulation, right? And then there's an ontology for the pi calculus, which will be very different than the lambda calculus. They see the world differently, right? Even though both of those ontologies are generated in terms of the bisimulation equivalence classes, right? But this now gives us a framework where we can go and explore that entire space. So I've not fixed the ontology, and like I was making this actually has practical considerations when we're talking about rendering this to computation, right? So Rachel St. Clair and her team have done a universal encoder for HDC, right? So hyperdimensional computing. And what I argued to Rachel back in the summer of 2023 is there isn't one universal encoder. There's an algorithm which will generate an encoder for each different notion of computation. So rather than Rachel having to fix an ontology, what she fixes is the encoding needs to preserve the bisimulation equivalence classes. That's the right property. Then she can get lots of different ontologies, because those different ontologies may correspond to a way of carving up the universe into different ways of doing compute, right? And that can be grounded all the way back in the biology, right? Different autocatalytic networks might get there sooner, so they have a different notion of compute. So in other words, if this theory is right, what we should see scattered all over the universe are versions of life that might not even be chemically compatible, right? But they're still recognizably life and still recognizably mind. And this gives us a framework to go and explore that computationally. All right, with that, let me say thank you so much for taking.
Yeah, a lot to absorb. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate all the engagement, all the questions, and I hope I will see you for the next talk next week.
Looking forward to it. A brilliant talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, Greg.